up to recently at Google Research and recently joined Google Android. As a native Chinese, I was very fascinated by Tom's work on Chinese ethnic group classification. It's actually interesting from a computer science point of view today that how would you classify people into who have been living in a particular patch of land for thousands and years, and how do you divide them into different ethnic groups? What features would you use? Is it the language they speak? Is it proximity in geography? Or is it the clothes they wear, or how they marry? So what features do you use to classify them to different categories? And Tom did the most thorough study of this, that how officially it was classified in the 1950s, with pretty important political ramifications in terms of representation, even though most of the representations in Communist China was token, but still it was important for all groups to be represented. And he traced and analyzed how that project went, and it was fascinating. But today he's going to talk about another topic that is just as fascinating, which particularly is interesting to me because as a research scientist, I have devoted a big portion of my career on studying how to enter information into computers. And Tom's study shows that much of this work we do today on mobile phones, on touchscreens, are actually foreshadowed by what Chinese engineers and inventors have done in the past many decades. So I'm very pleased to be able to invite him to give a talk on this topic today. So please welcome Tom Mullaney.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me okay? Excellent. So it's a great pleasure to be here and an honor, and I want to thank Shumenjai for inviting me to speak with you today. The talk of the paper has changed many times, many iterations, so we're going to keep the main title of A Chinese Typewriter in Silicon Valley, but the subtitle has changed a little bit from the abstract to How Chinese Typists Invented Predictive Text During the Height of Maoism. To give you a little bit of context, the broader set of questions that I'm working on right now in a book, I guess tentatively titled The Chinese Typewriter, A Global History, is a broader story of 19th and 20th century China, which pretty closely connected to the history of European, Euro-American imperialism, is the question of how to render the Chinese language compatible with a set of information technologies such as the telegraph, the typewriter, and later forms, which almost in their DNA have been so closely connected to alphabets, or more generally speaking, to languages with a very limited set of modules, be they alphabets or syllabaries. And so there was, during the 19th century and 20th century, and even today, this very fundamental question that I pose up here: is Chinese script, not the language as a whole, but is script, the Chinese script, Chinese characters, are they compatible with modernity, or must they be jettisoned so that China can modernize? And this was a major question in the 19th and 20th centuries, with many people saying, no, we have to get rid of characters, use English, even Esperanto, in order to modernize. And many even more who use the imagery of the Chinese typewriter in particular as kind of proof of this. I say proof, and I italicize that with my voice so as to say that the proof came in these sorts of concocted, imagined ideas of what a Chinese typewriter must theoretically look like. That would be an immense machine with thousands of keys upon which it takes even 5 people to type and so forth. And so you see some of the earliest and most derogatory and racist perceptions of this from the turn of the century. That top one is from an article in 1900, all the way through the kind of dregs of B-movie culture with the Tom Selleck movie, The Chinese Typewriter, into the famous dance coined by MC Hammer in You Can't Touch This, known as the Chinese Typewriter. That dance was called because it was meant to mimic what a typist must look like as they move across a massive keyboard into The Simpsons and so forth. So that is to say that within this story of the question, are Chinese characters compatible with modernity? The Chinese typewriter in particular became a kind of icon for those who said, no, it's not. And it's a surprisingly durable icon. And what I'm here to talk about today is that parallel to this story, there is a far richer, more significant and interesting story of those who did not give up on this idea that Chinese characters could be compatible or rendered compatible with technologies designed without Chinese in mind. I'm charting in my own work the kind of larger history about this involving Chinese telegraphy, typewriting, braille, and indexing systems and so forth. But what I'm going to talk with you about today, if I had to kind of make this relevant for an audience that is obviously very interested in deep history, but is also setting out to build things and make things, is that when I see the Chinese typewriter, I don't see this. I see a machine whose history is an incredible repository of design inspiration and some of the most eccentric and brilliant innovation, most of which never saw the light of day, never materialized into forms, but some of the most brilliant and penetrating analysis and innovation of human-machine interaction, of input, of data structuring, and many other dimensions. And so in particular, what I want to talk about today is a kind of episode that takes place in the 1950s in China. And this is going to be the sort of context. And I will be explaining this in a bit. This is a few snapshots of different Chinese typewriters in the 20th century. The episode comes from November of 1956 in the pages of the most widely circulated Chinese newspaper, the People's Daily, which featured an article in that fall, one of the fall issues, of a typist in the city of Luoyang in China that had performed this unparalleled feat. And was reported to have, using a Chinese typewriter, whose operation I'll explain in a second, using a Chinese typewriter, had typed at speeds verging on 80 characters per minute. Now, I invite you not to immediately compare that to QWERTY input or things like that, because I'm going to try to explain that they're largely irrelevant comparisons. But the important comparison is how fast had a Chinese typewriter, been at that point. Roughly speaking, if you look at a lot of the archival documents, teaching manuals, and so forth from the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and on, the average typing speed at this moment was about 20 to 30 characters per minute. So this thing, this event, this person in doing this, if it was real, represented a threefold increase in speed of input, if you can think of it that way, without any substantial changes to the kind of mechanism of the machine. This was not a new typewriter. This was some sort of change that had taken place to the existing machine. Now, to give you a sense of how the machine works, how these various models up here work, you'll notice that there's a tray bed. If you see right here in the clearest model here, there's a tray bed on the 1960s double pigeon model of 35 characters by 70 characters. These are free-floating metal slugs. If you were to pick up this tray and turn it over, they would all fall out. There is a tray selector that can operate along an XY axis and actually can XY, and then the tray bed itself, which can move left and right along one axis. And so you kind of move both, bring the selector in positions, push down on the lever, and the something pokes up the slug from the bottom. It is grabbed, inked, it strikes the surface of the platen, and then is returned in the same location. That's the basic functioning of these machines. Now, so if you can imagine, this is 2,450 characters. So the most important dimension of this is taxonomy, is the organization and disposition of these characters. Now, the way that in the 1920s and 30s and 40s characters on the machine had been organized will be very familiar to anyone in the room who reads or speaks Chinese. But for those of you who don't, it was a system known as the radical stroke system. And basically this system, which dates back to the Ming Dynasty, popularized in the Qing Dynasty, that is into roughly around the 16th to 17th to 18th centuries we're talking about, is a system by which the tens of thousands of characters in the Chinese language are subdivided into a set of 214 classes or categories based on the primary component out of which the character is built. So for example, one category of these 214 is the person radical category, this shape here. And here are some examples of characters that fit within it, that are built out of it. Another radical class is the water radical class here, these 3 strokes, and you can see 2 characters that would fit into that. And then within each class, the characters are organized according to the number of strokes it takes to produce them. So the character ta, meaning he, would come before the character zuo, because it takes more strokes of the pen or the brush to write the character zuo. This is the way that dictionaries had been organized and the way the typewriter had been organized. What the article in 1956 suggested was that this typist in the city of Luoyang had kind of taken a radical departure, if you will, from this system and reorganized the tray bed according to a natural language arrangement. And so if we take a sample, a very small sample of the 2,500 or so characters, those of you who don't read Chinese, follow with me now. The highlighted yellow character is the character tong. And the important thing about this is that unlike the previous organization, in which that character would have been put next to characters it has nothing to do with, in this reorganization of the tray bed in the 1950s, all of the adjacent, or many of the adjacent characters in the Morse neighborhood, the 8 cells around it, the disposition of those was such that they could be combined with the character tong in order to produce a real word. Most words in Chinese are actually made of 2 characters, not 1. And so, for example, the yellow character and it can be combined with what's below it, tong shi, meaning at the same time. To the right, tong qi, in the same period. And then invertedly with the character above it, gong tong, meaning shared. And then if you can do this with each of the characters on this, every character is both a center and a periphery, can be combined or combinable with everything around it. We have to, when we look at an article like this from the People's Daily, which we have to be very careful. We have to be very careful as historians not to believe what we read and kind of follow up. There had been many stories of model workers in the height of Maoism, model laborers who outproduced their quota, model farmers who outproduced their grain quota. And here we have a model typist who had outproduced their typing quota, their character quota. So we have to be very careful here. But interestingly, is having spent quite a long time checking up on this, we see that this actually happened and was, I'm going to suggest here, one of the earliest implementations of a system of kind of techno-linguistic system that we now think of as predictive text, or natural language arrangement, or however we want to describe it. So more broadly, I think, before I get into the nitty-gritty of this, I think it's pretty self-evident, but let me spell it out, that if this is true, then what this alerts us to is the need to look very much more seriously at techno-linguistic innovation in 3 contexts where we don't often go looking for it. China, the Chinese language, and in this case, mechanical pre-computer system. At the very least, predictive text is not associated with Chinese language, not associated with innovations in China, and is certainly very rarely or ever associated with things in the pre-computer information age. So if we have to begin by asking the question, this will be relevant here in a second. The primary innovation that I'm talking about here is obviously not the design of a new machine, but a new interface. This is a new interface between a Chinese typist and the machine. And so we have to ask the question, was there a context for this typist in Luoyang to kind of pick up and move around the modules on this interface? Was this a totally radical act, a very unprecedented act, or was there a context for this? And there was a context for this. And the simple framework for this is that unlike the story of the typewriter, and specifically the semiotic interface of a typewriter in every other part of the world, be it, let's refer to languages more particularly, be it English, French, Italian, Russian, Hebrew, Thai, Cambodian, Arabic, and so forth, in the story of which the semiotic interface of each of these typewriters at some point stabilized into QWERTY, AZERTY, and QWERTZ, and so forth. That the story of the machine interface of the Chinese typewriter never stabilized, was never meant to stabilize, and was understood as something that would constantly need to be adjusted or changed by the operator through a constant process of optimization. Why is that? The reason for this is comes in the fact that the basic put this up here, that the basic structure of the Chinese typewriter was based on this system called common usage. So there are many more than 2,450 characters in Chinese. There are tens of thousands. The idea of the common usage Chinese typewriter, and that's what we're talking about, is to select the most frequently used characters and to put them on the tray bed. And then the rest of them would either be in a box, about 5,000 characters of less commonly used characters, and then anything else beyond that would have to be written by hand. Okay? Now, the sort of the issue for us here is that no matter how perfectly you chose these 2,450 characters, no one set would be perfect for every given context. In a police office versus a bank, the common usage character would be different from one to the other. And so therefore, a typist in a police office would have to take an uncommon character and put it on the tray bed. And the same thing for a typist in a bank or a government office and so forth. The other, there's a diachronic or a temporal part of this optimization story, which is that from moment to moment, common usage characters fell out of existence, uncommon characters became common. And some prime examples of that pertain to the administrative geography of China. So, for example, in the teens and early 20s, there was a province known as Zhili province. So, so the characters zhi and li both appear on the machine in the teens. After roughly the mid-20s, the province of Zhili was abolished as an administrative region and was divided into a set of new provinces. Now, what happens to the tray bed? The character zhi is very, very common in many, many, many other Chinese words, and so it was kept. The character li is very uncommon on its own, and so it was jettisoned. The same thing happened with a province known as Fengtian, which no longer exists. After this transition, you can compare the tray beds and see that the character tian, which means sky, very, very common, is kept. And the character which means feng, which means to present something to a superior, was a very, very uncommon character, and so it was jettisoned. So this is all to say that there was a kind of built-in kind of churning optimization process in which these operators in 1956 would have been operating. It's very interesting that so actually let me tell you a little bit more about the structure of the tray bed here. Here are three different tray beds from three different periods, just to get this impression in your mind. The red region are the most commonly used characters. All of these are commonly used, but these are the most common used characters. And then the dark blue, or the kind of purplish regions, are the secondarily common usage. And I'll talk about the kind of light blue in a second. So there was even a structuring of frequency within the tray bed that will become relevant in just a moment. Now, what's interesting about this is it's not just the optimization of the machine was not simply at the level of the tray bed and the disposition of characters on it. It was also a question of how a Chinese typist would undergo training and how they train their body. And to put this in a comparative context again, because it helps illustrate the point, in Roman alphabet or Cyrillic or Hebrew or Arabic or so forth typing, the ideal state of being when you are typing is known as blind typing. If you are sitting there staring at the keyboard, you better go and practice a bit more. You know, the idea is that you can look at the manuscript or the text and then have a kind of non-visual relationship with the interface and just go. This way of interacting with a machine makes a lot of sense in alphabetic and syllabaristic languages, and makes no sense and was never endorsed in the case of Chinese typewriting. For the Chinese typist, and I put up some various typing manuals from different points in 20th century Chinese history, actually emphasize the need for the typist to refine to ever greater and greater ability their vision and their memory and their peripheral vision. And I'll give one example. The idea, one of the most important parts of being a good typist was to always be anticipating both cognitively and somatically the next character, the next character, the next character. So if you were to go to one character that is all the way over to the right of a tray bed, I know that my laser point doesn't work very well. Let's say you need a character over here, and then you're looking at the manuscript, you see the next character, and you realize that it's over here. You need to start kind of orienting your body in such a way, getting ready to move it back in that direction, And if you don't do that, you'll still be able to type, but you'll type very slowly. So that is to say that even in the training of the Chinese typist, because of the sort of almost built-in affordances and limitations, constraints, and abilities of the machine, that we see an analog to this in the way that a typist would train in China, as opposed to many other techno-linguistic contexts. One other very quick example that I like very much pertains to the what those of you who have read any Derrida would know as materiality of signifiers, and in a more concrete sense means that the typist would have to adjust the strength, the force that they use to press down on the typing lever depending upon the number of strokes in the character, because the number of strokes in the character translated directly into the weight of the character. And so some characters are one stroke, like the character E, meaning one. It's just one horizontal stroke. And then there's another one for dragon, long, which has more than 20 strokes. If you use the dragon strength force on the character 1, you could puncture the paper and therefore have to start all over again. And so this idea of kind of optimization, anticipation operated on many, many levels. Okay, but this is a kind of necessary but insufficient set of conditions to get us to this more radical change, this semiotic change, this change of interface that takes place, I'm arguing, in the 1950s. And so how do we get to a place where in 1956 someone actually sits down and removes all of the characters from the tray bed and then rebuilds some sort of natural language arrangement of all of the characters? How do we get to the place where someone would feel mandated or authorized or inspired to do that? The question of this is really connected to the politics of the 1950s, the politics of the 1950s, and in particular, a politics that was within 20th century China unique to the Maoist period, which was a centrally endorsed proletarianization of knowledge. That is kind of user-led innovation in a sense, where in a vast number of different expert domains, including seismology, paleontology, medicine, the central state in Beijing and the Communist Party was advocating mass participation of non-elite participants in these otherwise expert systems, and was also advocating the overturning of knowledge systems and the kind of, if you want to put it in a kind of a prose format, to take much more seriously folk knowledge, to take much more seriously the knowledge that everyday people have. And so there does seem to be a strong correlation between this advocacy and mandate and authorization that's being issued from the party state and the type of experimentation we see in the 1950s. So it's very, very difficult to locate the origins of moments like this, and in many cases, finding an exact point is not all that important. But if we had to choose the first moment in which we see a natural language arrangement of Chinese characters in an information technology environment, it takes place not in typewriting but in typesetting in the city of Kaifeng with the work of this a typesetter named Zhang Jiying. And Zhang Jiying worked as a typesetter both in the pre-communist era in the 1940s and then into the Maoist period in the 50s. And he posted very respectable typesetting speeds throughout most of his career. And his character rack, the rack where all the characters were displayed for his use, were also organized largely according to the radical stroke system, the same one that we saw before. Around 1951-52, inspired by this new mandate for the proletarianization of knowledge, mass participation, and so forth, he began to reorganize these characters to maximize the adjacency of those characters that go together. Some of the kind of prime examples for this come from the name of the press he worked at, the Xinhua She. So he said, well, I'm constantly setting Xinhua She. So why should I reach around his character rack? Why not just put them next to each other? Another example is Geming, revolution. I'm constantly saying Geming, or constantly setting this type, so might as well put them together. And then my favorite is Meidi, American imperialist. This was the time of the Korean War and the first really nationwide campaign of the Maoist period, which was aid Korea, resist America, aid Korea, as in connection with the Korean War. So this phrase, Meidi, was said over and over and over again. Now, what's interesting is it's very hard to say, was Jiang Jiying inspired by this central new mandate of the Communist Party, or were many people doing this and we just don't know about it? It's very hard to say. The one thing that we do know is that the party state was not only advocating or promoting this type of proletarianization of knowledge, but whenever it happened in a locale or a region, they were publicizing it and popularizing it. So Jiang Jiying became something of a little media star for a few years. He was featured in the People's Daily. There was a book published about his method. He was sent on a paid tour of China to various printing houses to tell people about his method. The Central Broadcasting Company filmed him doing his job, and he was eventually admitted into the party. And so he kind of was, his method was celebrated. It's very quickly after that celebration of his method that we start to see the same application of natural language arrangements of characters on the Chinese typewriter. And this brings us back to the 1950s and the story that began the talk. So this brings us back to, again, the same example. Now, what's interesting about this is that there are, if on a 42 key keyboard, there are 42 times 41 times 40, so forth, possible arrangements. On a tray bed with 2,450, there are 2,450 times, so forth and so on. There is effectively infinite number of arrangements, possible arrangements of these characters. And so what we see is that after the predictive turn in the 1950s, we see multiple people applying this to their own tray beds, centering around certain basically shared principles, and yet each of them completely individualized and completely idiosyncratic. There are no two predictive tray beds that are alike. And let me give you just a few examples of this. There's two tray beds that I'd like to talk about. One is a Chinese typewriter used at the UNESCO office in Paris. Another one is used in the United Nations office in Geneva. These are two separate Chinese typewriters and typists working in very different contexts. And I'll walk you through this as well. On the left one here, and this is 1930s, just to give a comparison against the predictive turn tray bed. In the middle here, in the UNESCO machine, we see this character in yellow, Mao. This is the surname of Mao Zedong. And if we look to the below it, the two characters below it are Zedong, so that he could type or she could type Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong, Mao Zedong quickly and easily. Emanating off to the right of it are the characters Zhu and Xi, Zhu Xi, Mao Zhu Xi, which is Chairman Mao. And so it's kind of, the Mao is again constellated in such a way that it can be kind of concatenated with a bunch of different characters that this type is needed. In the right example, in the Geneva machine, we see the exact same idea, but in essence constellated differently. We see, again, the character Mao in yellow, and now Mao Zedong doesn't go up, down, as in this example, but off to the left. And Mao Zhuxi, Chairman Mao, doesn't go off to the right, but goes down. So in essence, we see these typists converging around certain principles, but each one very idiosyncratically organized. To make this a bit clearer for those who don't read Chinese, we have the example of punctuation. Predictive text was even applied to punctuation. And numerals, but anyway, in the 1930s, the question mark, exclamation mark, period, comma were put where they kind of rationally belonged, all together in one place. And after the 50s, a set of typists began to say, well, that doesn't make much sense. We know that question marks always come after a question particle, because that's how you express, that's one of the ways you express the interrogative in Chinese is by the addition of particles. We know that the characters ma, ba, and na, those are in red there, are always followed by the question mark, so let's constellate it around the question mark on the machine. We see in the United Nations machine, by comparison, the exact same idea, but again, a different configuration of these other particles. Now, why are they differently configured? And this is the really fascinating thing that I'm sort of working with various kind of data visualization specialists and others to try to think about. It could be all sorts of things: left-handedness, right-handedness, the sort of mnemonic devices that one person prefers to remember the location or another. All sorts of factors could go into why this idiosyncrasy prevails. But kind of anchoring any of this idiosyncratic personalization are, again, these kind of cohering strategies that we often see from one example to the other. This is a basic heat map, which basically visualizes is a calculation of adjacency. It's the bright red or the dark red patches are those that in which the character can be combined with maybe 6, 7, or 8 of the characters in the surrounding area. The white, the very, 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 very light red, the white can be combined with 1. And then the black here indicates that the character cannot be combined with any of the characters in the Morse neighborhood to form a real Chinese word. This is a heat map of a tray bed from the Republican period, 1911 to 1949, before the type of innovation I'm talking about. So you can see that there is some almost accidental situations in which a character is flanked by other characters that it can be combined with. And then there's one part here that I'm happy to talk about why there is a collection there. The important thing is that once we go to after 1949, this is what the tray bed looks like. It heats up, it lights up, because the basic principle, again, is the maximization of adjacency of related characters. So to put them side by side, we can kind of get a sense of what all of these incremental innovations in the interface of the machine translated into. And this is how we explain an acceleration of the speed of typing that could be that high, as indicated in the People's Daily. Not just this leap, it's not just this leap that is so interesting. It's also, again, the variety between different interfaces. These are both the UNESCO and the UN machine, both of them predictively natural language arrangements, and how differently each of them behaves. They have clusters in different places. The kind of architecture of the arrangement is very, very different. And again, in terms of interpreting why, that's a very challenging act of working backwards from the arrangement. By the late 1980s and into the 1990s, we begin to see Chinese typewriting companies and Chinese typewriting instruction manuals, the appendix of which used to carry grids, like tables that showed you where all of the characters on the tray bed are. It's a very important thing for a manual to teach you. By the 1980s and 1990s, we begin to see tables like this that are empty, because they're basically saying to the user, you decide. You decide where to put the characters. Now, there are some suggestions. These characters here, well, it's hard to point to it. The characters along the side are saying you could probably put characters about communism here. You could probably put characters about higher education here, about war here, about science here, but they're just suggestions. Ultimately, it is left to the typist to decide where all of these arrangements are taking place. So, in essence, what this speaks to me is that manufacturers of these machines were in effect catching up with something that was a user-led innovation. So to close, I just want to ask a few sort of set of open questions. The first set of questions is kind of what about the computer? You'll notice that electrical automation, computing, word processing is noticeably absent from this talk. It's entirely about a mechanical typewriting environment. And if you go into the discussions of various innovations by Baidu or by Sogo or by various input methods that use predictive or algorithmic probabilistic determinations for input, the prevailing assumption is that this was kind of the thanks to the computer, which, like the Deus ex machina, comes in and saves Chinese from itself, in essence. And what you see actually when you look into the history of early Chinese computing in the 60s and 70s is by and large the virtualization or digitization of principles and applications that had been developed in the mechanical Chinese typewriting environment. That is to say that at the Chinese Academy of Sciences and various others working in the late 60s and 70s, they are very aware of what's going on in the mechanical Chinese typewriting environment, and they're trying to basically enhance or build upon that. And it's not a question of this innovation coming in exclusively from the outside and changing the game, as it were. So the larger question, I guess, is that, and I give this example here in Baidu, the Baidu example, all input systems, not just search engines, but all input systems for Chinese are all make use of predictive text, all of them now. And so there is this important question of where does this come from in the history of Chinese computing and Chinese internet. And quite obviously, I'm arguing that there is not an exclusive genealogy that dates back into the history I'm talking about, but one that certainly combines the history of Chinese typewriting and the history of computing more broadly. So if this is true, the question is, a sort of bigger question, is how did we miss the Taiping Rebellion? If there was this, no Chinese historians in the group, so okay, there's this massive civil war in China called the Taiping Rebellion. Anyway, there is a question of that if this innovation is taking place in the 20th century, then how do we keep missing it? Why do we, in large part, continue to ignore the history of information technology in China before maybe 5-10 years ago and imagine it as being, in essence, more of a proof of the anti-modernity of Chinese than anything we would ever look into to be inspired in our own innovation? And what I would like to suggest is that not only for my own purposes, but also maybe even for designers among you who are looking for a massive repository of experimentation and innovation, which may not have seen the light of day, but may itself provide inspiration and blueprints for things moving ahead. I'd like to suggest that the Chinese typewriter, as a problem, historically has operated in a similar type of inspiration as the original billboard ad back in the day that was designed to kind of challenge and inspire the most innovative, eccentric kind of thinkers in the world. And the Chinese typewriter, in its own way, throughout the course of the 20th century, became a magnet for not only innovators in China, but from all across the world. And same thing with Chinese computing and now into later technologies. And so it is actually an immense repository of inspiration and principles that I think we could all profit from looking more deeply into. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions. Why don't we start on the right and then go to the middle?
So, can you speak a little bit about how these typewriters actually work in terms of like how big they are, how do they get set up? Because it strikes me as one of the things about this is that it makes your typewriter a very personal device, right? You have to arrange it to your habit as opposed to the West. We sit down on any keyboard and we expect it to work immediately.
Right.
And that seems like a very different shift in how to design these things.
Right. Absolutely. Could everyone hear the question? Okay. So the machine was roughly, I'll just use my hands, is roughly about this wide. The tray bed itself is about this wide and this deep, okay? And then the machine itself kind of juts out from the back maybe about this far, and it comes from top to bottom it would be about yay tall, very, very heavy. So the dimensions of it are pretty comparable with many desktop systems we see, but the weight of it is significantly higher. But what you're talking about here, this kind of built-in almost personal relationship between the operator and the machine is absolutely true. So even before what I'm describing as the predictive turn in the interface, you would have to personalize your machine. Not only in terms of the time period and whether or not you work in a bank or a law firm, as I suggested, but things like maybe your coworker or your boss has a surname whose the character of the person's surname is within and of itself very infrequent. It doesn't show up in newspapers very much, but for you, it shows up every day, every page, and so you would have to make sure that your machine has that name. And so if we imagine a scenario in which someone was sick that day and couldn't come in, and someone else had to sit down at the machine, there would be before 1949 there would be a kind of basic roadmap. The person would know that this is organized according to radical stroke, but beyond that basic roadmap, they might not know where to go. They might not know how the other person personalized it. So it is a very different interface, just as from the get-go, than typewriting in practically any other language that we see. And then after 1949, this becomes even more so. You would not be able to use really effectively a typewriter that someone else had rearranged according to their own natural language arrangements. The tray bed is almost an embodiment of their consciousness. If you think about it, it's how I remember where everything is, how my body works, how I prefer this to be, and then you come and try to use it. It's like trying to figure out someone else's file folder structure on their laptop. It's very, very personal. The gentleman in the sweater, and then to the gentleman with the glasses. Yes.
Influence the technology. Did you see any evidence in your reading of the other way around?
I know, yeah.
That, because of the arrangement, it changed the language?
That's a great question. Yes?
You may have to repeat the question for the remote audience.
Oh, for the remote audience. Oh, I'm sorry. The question is so the talk mainly focused on how, in essence, people with their understanding of and their use of natural language, their own use of the language, reorganize the interface of the machine. Is there any evidence to suggest that the kind of reorganization of the interface machine cycled back and really transformed language? The quick answer is I suspect so. The longer answer is I suspect so, but it is going to take massive corpus analysis to really decide whether or not that's happening. We'd have to do stuff that really has never been done with the analysis of Chinese language material, high through. I mean, it really depends upon Chinese OCR becoming better, because we would need to do immense corpus analysis to see whether or not there are changes over time. The one thing that maybe countervails against the possibility, so that is to say that I suspect that it's true, but one thing that maybe suggests that it's not, is that the Chinese typewriter was mainly a re-inscription device, a reproductive device. You would start out with a manuscript or something, and you would copy it. You would produce a typescript version of it. What you don't see in the context of Chinese typewriting, as opposed to practically every other typewriting context, is the idea of the author sitting down at a machine and producing a manuscript. There's no such thing as the writer Lin Yutang in China sitting down at his Chinese typewriter the way that Allen Ginsberg might sit down. And this comes back to the common usage system, that not all of the characters are there. And it is the job of the poet and the job of the writer, in fact, to delve into the infrequent and the beautiful. And so maybe not. But I think that's one area that I'm trying to team up with distant reading and corpus linguistic specialists to see if it's possible to ask that question about linguistic change. The gentleman in the glasses, and then the gentleman in the black leather.
So there was also this
Sure. The question is, you know, the relationship between simplification campaigns and then this this kind of taxonomic reform of the trade bit. Are there any relationships? Because they are happening at the same time. They're happening in the early 1950s during Maoism. They take place in the 50s. There was an earlier abortive effort to simplify characters under the Republican regime, but the places where they seem to be related is that the typewriter became, and the tray bed in particular, became a highly politicized space or domain, if we think about it, because, for example, during simplification campaigns, there were notifications sent to typewriting manufacturers saying that you need to replace these traditional characters with simplified characters now, which from their perspective is a monetary, you know, is a financial burden. There's a financial burden on people at the local level that theoretically have to replace the character with another one that has been identified as the simplified version. And so people were reticent to do that because it just kind of cost money and was a pain. And so it became one of the places that the communist government was very eager, along with printing presses, very eager to promote simplification, because these were obviously the places that produced text. So you want to go to if you can change the characters on a typewriter and change a character on a printing press, then you therefore transform every page that gets produced thereafter. So in terms of them interacting or relating to each other causally, I don't see that all that much, but they are connected historically. Yes, sir. And then, gentlemen.
So, underlying your talk is the assumption that the language is stationary. But, I grew up in this country, and there was a much reading newspaper. So, the language became very, templatized. So, I wonder if there's any study on how much that affected the language, because it wouldn't make it more amenable for efficient encodings of this type.
Right. The question, if I can synthesize it, let me know if I get it right. I see it as a question: is there a relationship between the kind of templatization, I like that word, of language in Maoist China, which relates to the kind of newspeak phenomenon that happened in many communist contexts, and that because the language was in essence more predictable, that it was more amenable to a predictive text arrangement? And the answer is, I think yes. In the longer paper, in the longer project, that's actually an entire part of the argument, is that the emergence of a political rhetoric of unprecedented standardization during the Maoist period, of unprecedented kind of roteness, was itself largely facilitated the creation of a tray bed in which it would be very useful to create a natural language arrangement, because you know that you're going to be saying American imperialist over and over again. What's fascinating about it, I think, is that normally the idea of newspeak, this kind of 1984 image of the communist rhetoric, is typically understood as an inhibition, as an inhibiting factor to innovation. It inhibits thought because it's double plus good kind of idea of language. And it seems that perhaps there's a lot of credence to that argument, but in this case, we see the exact opposite. That for at least in this context, newspeak is inspiring or part of a history of radical techno-linguistic innovation, in which there is a kind of encouraging or inspiring momentum for the typist to make the tray bed as idiosyncratic and personally optimized as possible, so that they can more and more efficiently produce texts that are more and more rote, if you see what I mean. So do you see what I mean? There's actually a relationship between innovation and newspeak that we rarely see in other contexts, but that is highly relevant here, I think. Yes, in the back, and then in the black sweatshirt.
You mentioned,
I'm sorry.
you mentioned various factors that impact the usage of the tray bed layout, temporal and functional
The question pertains to spoken dialect, and if I can broaden it out, because it is a really interesting question about, I mean, really the question of dialect and Chinese language information technology as a whole is a very, very political question throughout really the 20th century. For the most part, there has been a kind of antagonistic relationship between Chinese information technology and dialect, in the sense that political leaders, manufacturers, and others have been very resistant to the idea of developing, for example, Cantonese input or Shanghainese input or Taiwanese input, or to even before that, before we think of input and whatnot, the question of whether or not different dialects in Chinese should be outfitted with their own written languages. And whether or not people should be able to publish, for example, a book in Cantonese, where the characters are actually, there are many Cantonese characters which do not exist in Mandarin Chinese. Should people be allowed to publish in that way, which is also a kind of information technology question? And the answer has consistently been no, because if we pair up the massive diversity of dialect diversity in China with written form, we will in some sense institutionalize these cleavages, and that could actually damage the territorial integrity of the country. That's why most regimes in the 20th century in China have been very, very and other elites, political elites, have been very focused on the promotion of a single standard. And so, for example, with Pinyin, with Chinese Pinyin input, that is actually not only an information technology tool, but a pedagogical tool. That people know that if they're going to use a computer in China, they have to use Pinyin input. And Pinyin input is connected directly to the Chinese standard. And so the very act of learning how to use a computer is in some way, shape, or form becoming oriented towards the standard. And so they've been very resistant to develop alternate techniques for that. Let me just, I jumped to you, I'm very sorry.
I'm trying to kind of put it right to get the kind of answer I really kind of want to get you. So did you try to kind of figure out how they actually basically try to reverse engineer the process that led into this, and how the actual typists made this happen? I mean, you don't find notes or anything. I mean, if I want to design it today with the kind of vast tools I have, I may do some stuff.
Right.
But how did they do it with like the numbers? Very quickly become very large numbers.
Right.
And how do they arrive at that? I mean, I could think of organic ways to do that. Like, I mean, whenever you see two far things, just move them near each other. But how did they do
Yeah. So the question, and this the basic question is, how did these re-engineers of their machine do it? How did they go about the process of producing these natural language arrangement tray beds? That's actually why, or how I came to be here today was I gave a talk at Stanford, which is my home institution, and it was within STS, and STS context was attended very luckily for me by Scott Clemmer from HCI at Stanford, who then invited me to give a talk there. And I was talking with Scott, and I said, I need to talk to someone who works on optimization, because I need to know how someone right now would think about the optimization of such a hyper-complex system, not because I want to build a Chinese typewriter, but because I want to hear someone talk about the process of optimization so that it can excite my imagination and excite my sort of heuristic complex, so that I can go back and have more intelligent search more intelligently for exactly the answer that you're talking about. It is entirely a question. There's two pathways to answering the question. I don't have an answer yet. That's going to be that's the kind of reason that I actually first emailed. Sorry, to complete the story. Then Scott said, you need to talk to Shumin Jai. And then he put us in contact, and we had a really wonderful conversation. And then that manifested itself in today. But I have to admit, with the tools at my disposal, I'm at a loss, because I can try to reverse engineer from the tray beds that I have, and that's where I really need to pair up with someone who thinks about those problems every day. And then the other thing that I can line up is ethnographic or oral historical interviews with typists, but even that is a very challenging thing. Tell me back in 1970 how you decided to move character 1 to space X, and that's embodied memory. That's not something that they're going to have written down somewhere. So even that is an incredibly challenging process. But that's, I think, an incredible payoff, not just for me as an historian, but for designers who are looking for inspiration. In my opinion, the gentleman. Oh, I'm sorry. Actually, I'm sorry. Maybe if I can keep the order and then to Schumann. Yes.
Province A goes away and province B comes in, and character A has to leave the radical section X and go way up here, and
right.
B is over here. You have to move every character
yes.
to actually get this to be in the right position.
Right.
Would that actually happen? Or do they just say, like, screw it, we're putting this one in
No. Yeah. So the question pertains to before 1949, before the natural language rearrangement here. How did the process of optimization of tray beds in the Republican period take place? And the process that you just described is exactly what would have been required. There was I've seen no tray beds where some character is just strangely out of place, but everything is always in place. So if you think about it, the closest analog we have is the kind of that game with the missing plastic, with the plastic pieces with one piece missing, and you've got to move it around. You move one thing, everything must move. Everything must move to fill in the space. So that's an important dimension here, is that even before the 50s, there are dimensions or characteristics that are built into the tray bed itself and into this particular technolinguistic apparatus that provided a context for the more radical transformation we see in the 50s. But every tray bed I've ever seen exhibits no laziness in terms of some weird character out in the middle of nowhere. So yeah. Yes.
Tom, as a historian, you put many interesting socio-political context to major changes to the machine. But much of the results could be looked at or designed purely from a language or efficiency point of view. Just for a given corpus, you can optimize the arrangement so you have least amount of movement. So I wonder, which you already touched on, but I still wonder how important is the political, social background.
Right. That's. I feel like I owe you something, because you give me a chance to kind of mention one slide that I skipped, which was very important, which was the fact that, see if I can find it very quickly, that even in the Republican period, there was one small part. Remember in the heat map, there was that one little bright red part. There was a cluster. There was one tiny region of the tray bed, roughly 2 cells wide by maybe 10 cells tall. So out of 2,500 roughly, so a very small region, which were arranged according to natural language arrangements. And these were Provence names. So the example up here has, let's look at the character jiang that's highlighted in yellow, which means river. Jiang can be combined diagonally with su to create the province name Jiangsu. It can be combined with the character to its left, zhe for Zhejiang, which is another province. And then it can be combined through this kind of neat kind of knight, like in chess kind of thing of Heilongjiang from the bottom to the top to the right. This was the one, there's few important things about this. One is that we know both here and in very esoteric discussions by some language reformers that people were thinking about this in the 30s. They were thinking about this. They were it was in the general swirl of possibility as a known thing. And at the same time, we also know that in the 20s and the 30s was a time of hyper innovative, hyper iconoclastic language reform. This was the time when people were saying, let's get rid of all the characters and replace it with French. Let's simplify all the characters. Let's replace it with a symbolic notation system. Very, very crazy sort of ideas. And yet, even with this context, the step towards the kind of radical departure towards this new arrangement was never tried, to my knowledge. And I've seen a lot of these machines now, more than I care to admit. And so there seems to be, it seems to be that if this is purely a question of efficiency and optimization, that we would have seen something far earlier, because people would have known it. But that it was as if something was keeping the dams, the water behind the dam, and that it really took the 50s, and it really took Maoism, and it really took this idea of the kind of mass overturning of knowledge systems to lay dynamite to that dam and just say, okay, everybody, do whatever you want to the tray bed, do whatever you want, however you see fit. And then from that moment on, it takes place, it goes in the People's Daily, it shows up in 3 different places, it shows up in dozens of other places, and not everyone does it. But suddenly it starts to spread out until by, again, that slide from the 1980s shows that even typewriter manufacturers were like, okay, you guys are better at this than we are. You have better ways of optimizing your machines than we could ever come up with. So the semiotic interface is yours, basically. So I do think that there is, I thought about that for a long time, and ultimately I came to the conclusion that the last piece of the puzzle in this is counterintuitively Maoism.
Well, unfortunately, we have reached the end of this fascinating talk. Let's thank again for Tom's
Thank you.
great talk. And for those of you who want to,
Thank you very much.